Reading passage, okay. All right, so with this reading passage, let's take a quick look at that then. If there are any others that anyone else wants to kind of revisit based on your own kind of analysis and assessment of your practice tests when you were scoring them, because remember, you're also supposed to be reviewing the different types of questions and helping to find particular like weaknesses for certain question types that are more challenging for you so that we can work on them together, because I can't work one-on-one with everyone in this type of class setting. So unless you tell me that there is an issue with a particular type of question, I'm going to assume that you are okay with it. Okay, so if like vocabulary and context type questions always trip you up, please tell me and we can kind of discuss it. But unless you tell me or let me know that you are having an issue with particular questions or particular sections of the exam with the reading or the writing and language test, or even the essay if you're doing that one, I can't assist you. So you need to tell me, you need to provide that information for me so I can better help you. Okay, so looking at question 1, so practice test 6. For those of you who have a textbook, this begins on page, give me one moment. Should begin about page, the actual test begins on page 818 for the reading test. And the first question looks like this. I will, of course, send everyone a copy of my own annotations and for practice test 6 after class today. So everyone can kind of compare your analysis and identification of the questions to my own in terms, and use mine as a model, okay? But let's take a quick look at the passage first. Okay, so here we have, it's adapted from this piece. Let's see. Okay. So, okay. The first question is the main purpose of the first paragraph is to, so this type of question is, can anyone identify what specific type of question this should be? Like, is it, yeah, 818 is the page that the actual exam in the textbook starts on. For question 1, that doesn't start on, that starts on 819, okay? All right, so can anyone identify for me what type of question this is from our types for the reading passage? You can type it in the chat. Anyone brave enough to volunteer? No? Okay. It's first thing on a Saturday morning, I understand. All right, so this is it's essentially asking you to identify the function of the first paragraph, what the author's intention is with this particular paragraph. So you're dealing with not the main purpose of the entire passage, which is a purpose question. This happens to be on a more minute level where you're dealing with just a paragraph. So what essentially a main purpose of a paragraph deals with the function of and usage of that paragraph in the broader context of the work as a whole. Okay. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah. Anyone not understand that? Okay. So with this question, what do you think it's asking you to do? Anyone? No? Okay. So essentially what it's asking you to do is identify the function of the first paragraph. Okay, so in order to identify that, we need to actually look at the first paragraph. Okay, so that's why you really want to be annotating. So in this version of the practice test online right now is just the generic version that the College Board has online. So it does not contain any of my annotations for you. But like I said, I will share that with you later with our homework. So what is typically the function of a first paragraph? Does anyone know for anything? It depends on what type of work we're dealing with, right? Um, so what type of work are we dealing with here? Yeah, so we're dealing with typically a first paragraph of any work is going to start introducing whatever your topic is or what your, like if it was an essay, it would be your introduction, right? That would be pretty straightforward. If it was a story, which this happens to be, it happens to be a narrative of some sort, right? We're dealing with literature, right? So this is one of our literary passages. You're dealing with basically exposition. Okay, so remember your narrative structure and what kind of the overall structure of a narrative is. So you start with your exposition where you're introducing background information. You kind of progress until you get to the point where you have your conflict, right? That your issue, the problem that happens, and then you at that point you then start having your rising action until you get to your climax, which is the pinnacle of the kind of conflict that brings about basically the resolution or the denouement, which is another term for resolution, and then that kind of ends up ending the whole narrative, like because it kind of resolves or provides some sort of closure to the story, depending on what type of story it is, because some will still remain open-ended. It depends on the type of narrative you're dealing with. Okay, so in this particular paragraph, you're exactly right that this is going to be, we would typically expect this to have introductory information. But since we're kind of being thrown in the middle of this narrative, we don't necessarily get I mean, this is an excerpt, right? So it's adapted from a larger work. So we're kind of being taken out of context for the entire story, but we still have enough context to be able to understand what this purpose of the paragraph is. Um, so basically, if we kind of, I mean, remember that you want to be able to read through, this is one of the paragraphs that you definitely want to make sure you're reading through. If the literary passage tends to be your kind of more difficult of the different types of passages that we see on the SAT, you want to still make sure that you're trying to read through at least the first paragraph or two to give you a glimpse at what the whole work is about, okay? So it's going to have key information in here. So in the first paragraph, the reader is introduced to Nawab, who is a father of 12 daughters who feels compelled to make more money to care for his family, right? So they kind of say in here, let me see if I can find it. He must proliferate. Let's see, I know that's where it begins. Yeah, so basically, he must proliferate his sources of revenue. The salary he received from KK Haruni for tending the tube wells would not even begin to suffice. So basically, line 6 to 7 in that kind of excerpt here is basically focusing on, like the rest of the paragraph then kind of goes about focusing on identifying ways, like the way it kind of focuses that introduction of that idea that he needs to make money. He needs to generate revenue, right? And then it basically kind of moves on to discuss how the remaining, like the rest of the paragraph kind of deals with the way Nalab attempts to proliferate those income sources by identifying some of the money-making schemes Nalab undertakes, including setting up a flour mill and a fish farm and attempting to fix both radios and watches. I apologize if everyone can hear my cat. She is not happy that I'm not paying attention to her right now. So my apologies. Okay, so another Saturday morning. Okay. So basically what this paragraph is about, if we look at like the main purpose, the function here, is it to characterize Nalab as a loving father? You could possibly stretch that and say, yeah, because I mean, clearly he wants to take care of his family, but that's not really the right conclusion based on the actual content in that first paragraph, right? So it can't really be that, even if that is a possibility. I mean, we could leave it as a possibility in our answer choices if we're kind of trying to eliminate some, but the rest of that isn't evidence. It's evidence of something different, okay? It's really focusing on money making. And basically his ways of trying to provide for his family. B doesn't work either, because it's not really showing a typical day in his life. Like it's providing different different ideas that he's had, different weight methods he's used to kind of pursue different money-making schemes, really. I mean, like, so that he can provide for his family. So his goal is to provide for his family, to earn income and provide for his family. But it isn't really outlining a typical day for him, right? I mean, it's basically kind of introducing who he is and kind of setting the stage for us in terms of what it is that he's trying to accomplish, right? So it can't really be B either. It definitely can't be B. C, it is C, for those of you who have gone through this. So basically describing Nalab's various money-making ventures, but just let's look at D just to kind of figure out whether or not that would have been a choice that we could have easily eliminated. So to contrast Nalab's and Haruni's lifestyles, we really only get a little bit like a very little bit of who Haruni is, right? So here, I mean, we kind of understand that he's a servant kind of sorts, like, or he works for Haruni, and that so we do kind of get the impression that there is a little bit of a contrast there in terms of their lifestyles, but that's not what this question or the purpose of this paragraph. The purpose of this paragraph is describing the ways in which Nalab is trying to earn money for his family. So does that make sense to everyone? Yeah. Okay. So basically what you needed to be able to do with this type of question, this would be a question that you would answer after you've kind of gone through more of the detail questions. Okay. So even though it's a function and usage type question, it's dealing with ideas more than it is dealing with specific words or phrases or kind of in a smaller context on a sentence level or a word level. So you would probably want to focus on this type of question after addressing more detail-oriented questions, so text detail questions. Like I would have expected you to tackle the usage and vocabulary and context question in number 2 before tackling number 1. Number 1 would be something that you would tackle before dealing with something on a broader level of the text as a whole, because you're looking on a paragraph level. So you want to focus on things. Remember, you always want to start with your detail questions. So detail questions are questions that oftentimes will focus on a word level, a sentence level, or within a smaller context than on a paragraph or text level, okay? There's a reason you start with details, and that's because it's going to help you in the long run better understand and process and internalize the story or the work that you're reading. So you want to make sure that you are focusing on those detail questions first, because they're going to be the easiest ones for you. Because typically in a detail type question, remember, you're going to be given at least some direction in terms of where to look in the text, which is basically your best friend on this exam. Like, being able to have that kind of information is going to save you so much time and headaches in terms of trying to find that information as quickly as possible. So like in question 2, in comparison to question 1, you get the line number. Line 16, you get the specific word, and then you have to figure out what its function and usage is in context, so that you can understand the vocabulary in context, in the context of the sentence, and then in the context of the work as a whole, in terms of what the author's intention is or intended meaning with this particular stylistic choice with diction. Okay. Does that make sense, everyone? Yeah. Any other questions that you wanted to go through, that anyone wanted to go through from practice test 6, either on the reading sections or dealing with strategies or dealing with particular question types or question numbers from the reading test or the writing and language test, or even the essay? We will be getting to discussing the essay in one of our future classes here. Question 5 on the writing. Okay. Anyone else have any questions on the reading before we change gears and move to the writing? No. We can always come back. Okay. Question 5. Okay, so one thing to note, kind of, and just remember in contrasting the reading section to the writing and language section, is that the text on the reading section are actually excerpts from real works, okay? Whereas the kind of passages that you see on the writing and language test were specifically designed by the test makers in order to allow them to have more control over the language that's being used, over the grammar, and the kind of concepts that they're testing you on. So it gives them more authority, whereas with a reading passage, they can only modify a text so much. And change the author's meaning. So this gives them more control. So remember that these passages were specifically created for the exam. So we have question 5. Okay. So which choice provides the best transition from the previous paragraph to this one? Okay. So this type of question requires understanding what they mean by transition. So you should understand that a transition word, phrase, or a transitional sentence can perform different functions depending on the type of transition word that's used or transitional phrase in a sentence. And what we do with transition words is basically identify ways to help us smooth out our ideas, or like to segue from one idea to the next, okay, in a clear, concise manner. Okay, because we want our reader to be able to follow our train of thought, because we want them to be able to read and understand and support our ideas ultimately. So we need to be able to do that as writers. So what this type of question is doing is identifying the correct, like the best transition word, or the best kind of sentence way to create a transitional sentence to help you connect from one paragraph, which is up here, to the next, and then introduce the following bit of text that follows number 5, like the first paragraph. So if we're actually looking at this paragraph, what are we dealing with? What type of sentence are we dealing with? Does anyone know? So it's going to be a transitional sentence, but it's going to also fulfill a different function. Anyone have can anyone hazard a guess for anything? So if no one's going to hazard a guess, then we can kind of just discuss it. But look at the organization, the placement of this sentence in the context of the paragraph. What type of sentence are we dealing with because of that placement? What does that placement kind of tell us about what the function of this sentence is in this paragraph? Any ideas? Any thoughts? No? Okay. So regardless of what type of text we're dealing with, this is going to be a topic sentence, okay? So this is introducing the main idea of the paragraph, okay? But there's text that came before it. So it's part of the larger work, a necessary resource for science, right? Because questions 1 to 11 cover that first passage, okay? So yeah, I mean, essentially what it's supposed to be doing is establishing what the topic is for this particular paragraph. But it's also because because of the position of this particular paragraph within the larger work as a whole, within that, I mean, it's what, the third paragraph? Yeah, it's the third paragraph of this work, right? So we're dealing with, it's a science passage, right? So we're dealing with most likely an article of some sort that they're trying to give us here. So basically, in third paragraph of an article. So at this point, it should be a body paragraph that we're dealing with. Okay, so it is a topic sentence. So it's not going to be something like a hook or a kind of attention getter that you would see maybe at the beginning of an introduction. Or it won't be like restating the thesis statement, because there should be another paragraph. There's another paragraph after that. So we know that based on its position within the context of this whole essay, this whole article, that it's a body paragraph. So therefore we can understand that it's going to give us establish a topic for us that the essay is trying to, or the article is trying to convey to us. So we would expect to kind of find a main idea here about the paragraph. But remember, we can also have different types of sentences, different types of topic sentences. So it could be, even if it's introducing an idea, it might not be directly stating it. So it might not be a direct topic sentence. It could be an indirect one that will kind of allude to the topic or vaguely introduce the idea, introduce the kind of broader topic without explicitly stating specifically what this paragraph is supposed to be about. Okay. Or we could have a rhetorical topic sentence, right? Where it's asking a question that we know that the author is going to answer, right? So those are kind of our options in terms of topic sentences. But we also know that this is supposed to be a transitional sentence, okay? Because that's kind of what this question is asking us. Which choice provides the best transition from the previous paragraph to this one? So typically in a paragraph structure, you're going to expect the concluding sentence of a preceding paragraph to act as a conclusion to that initial paragraph, to kind of restate the main idea of the paragraph, or to kind of provide the kind of overall conclusion about the findings that were established in that paragraph, in this type of text. Okay. But at the same time, a concluding sentence, like the one which precedes this paragraph, this particular sentence, would help to transition between ideas typically. Okay. But we're dealing with the SAT, and they don't like to follow standard rules like that. They expect you to know those standard rules in terms of placement, of where you typically can expect to see a transition from one idea or one paragraph to another. Okay. Doesn't mean that they're not going to throw like a wrench at you, basically, in terms of where they place things, such as like placing like a thesis statement in a non-standard spot, or a concluding sentence here. So they really don't give you in this previous paragraph a really concrete concluding sentence. They kind of end with more of a they do give you kind of a deduction, that they're like a conclusion that they do make, but they don't really kind of seamlessly transition it into their next idea. So you would then expect that the function of this sentence for number 5 is that it needs to help transition between the previous idea and the kind of objective of this next paragraph, of where this work is going to. Okay. So in this case, for question 5, if we kind of look at what they have, they say one mission of the experimental lakes area is to conduct research that helps people better understand threats to the environment. Does that sentence kind of work? Anyone have any thoughts? I mean, all of you should have scored this, so you should all know what the correct answer actually is. So this one, I mean, if we kind of break that sentence down, one mission of the experimental lakes area is to conduct research that helps people better understand threats to the environment. In the context of this paragraph, does that make sense? And does that actually help transition between our ideas about like dealing with the kind of large blooms of blue-green algae or cyanobacteria that were affecting large bodies of water? So dealing with algae, basically. Does it kind of, it doesn't really connect to that idea. So one mission of the experimental lakes area is to conduct research that helps people better understand threats to the environment. That's more of a statement than a, which is fine, but it's not really giving us a transition here. It's basically giving us a fact. So basically, A can't be right because it's not giving a specific reference to the previous paragraph, and it's far too general. Okay, it's far too general to be tied to this paragraph. I mean, it's a kind of a good statement of fact, but it requires further explanation and further detail and evidence to kind of support that conclusion. And it's not fulfilling the function that this sentence is supposed to be doing here. Okay, B and D are also incorrect. So let's look here. So B says the experimental lakes area is located in a sparsely inhabited region that experiences few effects of human and industrial activity. So it's not really introducing any connection to the previous paragraph, right? It's just kind of providing background information, right? And it's kind of superfluous. It doesn't really help the argument at all. D says the process by which water becomes enriched by dissolved nutrients such as phosphates is called eutrophication. eutrophication. Sorry, it's first thing in the morning. Pronouncing scientific terms doesn't always work for me first thing in the morning. Linguistic terms, that's another thing. But anyway, so I digress. So here, looking at this, the options that they give us, none of those really work of the choices we've looked at so far, because B and D, like A is incorrect because it doesn't specifically reference it, anything, and it's too general. It doesn't really fit here. It's not performing the right function in the sentence. B and D don't work because they contain unnecessary details that do not connect the ideas in the paragraphs. So it's not connecting to what this paragraph is talking about, which is dealing with specific details about kind of the work that they do, like the experiment that they end up doing, and to kind of understand what is scientifically happening here, right? They don't do that. None of those options really do that we've looked at. So they're containing unnecessary details that don't connect the ideas in the paragraph. So they're really just, they're irrelevant. They're not appropriate. So by deduction, you basically are left with C, which says, to isolate the cause of the algae, Schindler and Brunskill performed another experiment, this time using Lake 226. Okay, so this sentence is exactly what we're looking for, okay, because it is connecting in that first part to isolate the cause of the algae, so the algae that we were just talking about in the previous paragraph, and then it's using that to segue into Schindler and Brunskill performed another experiment and establishing specifically which lake they were using, which is the subject in part of the subject in this paragraph. Okay, so C is the only possible choice here because it contains the best transition between the two paragraphs. It performs the function, the grammatical and rhetorical function that needs to happen in this instance. Okay, the previous paragraphs basically describe the experiment that Schindler and Brunskill conducted in Lake 227. And this paragraph is about an experiment that they performed in Lake 226. So it's connecting, they're related ideas, and they're kind of helping to transition between this is like scenario 1 that we tested, this is scenario 2 that we tested, and this is how they relate to our idea that about this algae. Like, so you're connecting your ideas very seamlessly in this kind of example. So only choice C really provides the transition that introduces the new experiment in Lake 226. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So in this type of question, what you really need to be able to do first is to identify what is it asking you. Okay, in this case, it's asking you to make an editorial decision regarding a transitional phrase, or like a transitional sentence in this case, okay? Because we're dealing with not just on a word level or a sentence level, we're also looking at a paragraph level and the work on a more global level, okay? So you need to understand what type of transition, like what specifically within the realm of transitions they're asking you to look at in terms of writing, because this is multifaceted. So there are many different kind of levels to this question that you have to kind of understand. And they kind of give that to you in the framework of the question by saying, transition from the previous paragraph to this one. So they're giving you your framework of where to look and what kind of information you should be paying attention to. So this requires you to do more reading. But again, you don't necessarily have to reread the entire paragraph. You can, especially if you're taking notes, if you've been doing annotations alongside each of these passages, you can identify what the main topic is of, like, the main idea of each paragraph. So here we're dealing with their experiment at Lake 227, identifying algae, right? Or cyanobacteria, basically, with large bodies of water. So those types of ideas, you have to understand what the ideas are, as well as what the grammar, like what the actual writing conventions are required, like the understanding the rhetorical choices, rhetorical strategies that the author is using. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah? Okay. Any other specific questions before we kind of dive into grammar from the exam? I mean, from the practice test? No? Okay. So no one has any additional questions from any of them? So you either all understand them or you got every single question correct. So, okay. No? Number 6. Okay. All right. So if we look at question 6 on the writing and language section, right? That was for that one. Yes. Okay. Okay. So so looking at this question, so we're still dealing with the same paragraph. And if you don't understand from the question 5 what the main idea of this paragraph was, you don't necessarily need to know that for this particular question, because this is more of an understanding grammar question. Okay, so question 6 is dealing with a few different things. So you're dealing with understanding how to best structure this sentence to convey an idea or to convey a given meaning, a particular meaning here. So choice B is the correct answer because it's concise and it doesn't repeat the idea of addition. Okay, so what that means, so let's kind of walk through why the other question, why the other choices are incorrect, and maybe that will help you understand why B is the only possible choice here. Okay, so choices A, C, and D are incorrect because they're repetitive. Okay, so let's kind of look at that. So let's look at the sentence in entirety. So if you just focus on the underlined section, that's not going to help you. Okay, when you're dealing with grammar, you need to look at it on, you do need to look at it at a detailed, minute level of word in a given context within a sentence or within a phrase and within a sentence. But you also need to kind of broaden your horizon a little bit in order to understand what that sentence or what is actually happening between the ideas that kind of precede it and follow it, to make sure that it is grammatically and rhetorically appropriate. Okay, that it's an effective use of language. Okay, so here, basically, I mean, if you had just focused on the underlined portion, you're not going to understand how it fits into the broader context, okay? Because and source of carbon was added, and a source of carbon was added. That is a grammatical construction, but it's not the most appropriate one here, okay? Reason is because you have to look at the full sentence and what it's trying to accomplish. So what's the function of the sentence? And what is it actually requiring you to do and think about on an idea level? Okay, so this sentence actually begins up here. This is actually it's a complex sentence here. I mean, it's a compound sentence, but it's a compound complex type sentence here that we're dealing with. So it's not just a straightforward, very simple independent clause. We're dealing with a kind of convoluted one that is a bit, a lot to take in. Okay, so you need to go all the way back up here at the very least to start. Okay, so in one half of Lake 226, they added phosphates, nitrates, and a source of carbon. In the other, they added just nitrates and a source of carbon was added. So reading through the entire sentence, you can automatically tell that there are issues, okay? Because not only is the second independent clause in this case, so both of these are independent clauses, so that means they're complete sentences, okay? They're being combined with a semicolon, okay, which is a correct way to combine two different independent clauses together, okay, rather than using a comma and followed by a conjunction, for instance, okay? So what this sentence, but because they're being used in, they're being combined, you definitely need to look at them together in order to be able to reach the appropriate conclusion for this answer, okay? One other thing that you need to notice is reading in isolation. In the other, they added just nitrates and a source of carbon was added. That doesn't make sense, okay? Because it's being overly repetitive on two accounts, okay? You have the first account, they're repeating added and was added, okay? And so not only are they now using the passive voice for was added, because they're using a kind of linking verb plus a plus a past participle to form a past tense, which is not using an active verb, which means that it's weakening your argument when you're using the passive voice. So remember, your teachers will probably be telling you in any of your writing classes, don't use the passive voice because it detracts, it makes you come across as less authoritative when you're writing. And you need to be able to pick up on things like that, like why you shouldn't be using that type of construction. Whereas it's much stronger if you say they added versus it was added, okay? Another kind of major difference grammatically within this sentence, just within that construction, is that the subject changes. So they added is dealing with the scientists, right? The scientists are the ones that are adding things, whereas there's an unstated it was added, a source of carbon was added. You don't have I mean, a source of carbon like the carbon itself can't or the source itself can't add itself, right? It can't actually physically do the action, whereas the scientists can do the action. They're the ones actually doing the action. So the source in this part of the sentence is receiving the action. It's having the action done to it. Okay, so you're dealing with a different type of verb in this particular example. But what you really just need to pick out here is that they're being repetitive here. They're saying they added just nitrates and a source of carbon was added. So the was added was completely unnecessary. So you can immediately eliminate this choice A, as a possibility because it's ungrammatical. It doesn't, I mean, technically speaking, if you look at it in isolation and a source of carbon was added, that is a grammatical construction, but combined within the larger independent clause, within that independent clause that it's a part of, it's not a grammatical construction because it's being, I mean, it is grammatically correct. Let me rephrase that. It is grammatically correct, but it's imprecise in terms of its use of language. It's being repetitive, okay? It's being redundant. based on the language that's being used, okay? It's not serving any specific purpose. So you should really just end the sentence at, in the other, they added just nitrates. That would have been a perfect place to end that sentence, but they didn't. So we have additional information we have to include, okay? So that's one thing. So the other kind of thing that is repetitive here is the source of carbon itself, right? Because if you look in the first half of this combined two independent clauses that we have here, you have in one half of Lake 226, they added phosphates, nitrates, and a source of carbon. So we already introduced that we're dealing with carbon, right? And we already kind of introduced that we're dealing with nitrates, but we're contrasting because we know that because the kind of the sort of transitional phrase that we have in the other, so you have on one hand you have one thing, on the other you have the other thing, okay? They're introducing that they're contrasting these ideas. So you need something, you need a phrase that's going to indicate that, that's going to keep up that idea, okay? So if you kind of look here for question 6, so A, C, and D, so if you look at, we know that A is already wrong, right? C plus also a source of carbon, that is completely redundant. It's completely ridiculous. It's using two different addition transitional words in this case, okay? Plus also, no one says that. That's not an example of strong writing. That is an example of being overly repetitive for no particular purpose, okay? So if you said plus a source of carbon, or you said also a source of carbon, then I would be more willing to integrate that into this kind of discussion here. But as it is, plus also, no. I can immediately eliminate that, and I can also eliminate it because I've established that this independent clause is contrasting, not adding information. It's contrasting information with the previous independent clause that it's attached to. Does that make sense to everyone so far? With me? Yeah? Okay. So we can really immediately eliminate A and C. So then if we're down to kind of B, which is the answer choice, and then you are also down to D. Like if we look at D, it says, but also adding a source of carbon, but is a contrasting transitional phrase or transitional word here. But using but also adding, like they're conflicting ideas there. And it's overly repetitive because again, it's using that word adding, like it's using a form of the verb add to integrate additional information that we already had and we don't need to integrate again. It's being repetitive. So no, we can't use this particular example here. So that kind of leaves us with just B, right? Because B, if we read it in context in that sentence, it says, in the other, they added just nitrates and a source of carbon. It's clear, it's concise, it is dealing with just the necessary elements that you need in order to convey the message that that this sentence is trying to convey. If you read it in the broader context of the full sentence, which is the compound sentence that we have kind of compound complex sentence we have kind of going on here. In one half of Lake 226, they added phosphates, nitrates, and a source of carbon. In the other, they added just nitrates and a source of carbon. It's golden. It's perfect the way that it is that way, okay? Because it's clear, it doesn't add any extra information that we already established. It doesn't add any unnecessary information. And it kind of performs the function that's needed here, where you're already introducing the idea that you're adding something, you're adding ingredients of some sort. In this case, it's nitrates and carbon, right? But does this all make sense to everyone here? Yeah. So B has to be the right answer because it's dealing with concision. It's the concise answer. It's clear and straightforward, and it helps to kind of, I mean, this was a really good example to kind of look through because you're dealing with a complex grammatical construction, okay? And you really need to be able to understand that sometimes you can't just look at it in an isolated form of grammar. You need to at least look at it on the sentence level. And sometimes where you think the sentence level will end at independent clause isn't quite the case when you're dealing with a compound sentence or a compound complex sentence, okay? You're dealing with ideas, you're dealing with thoughts when you're dealing with writing, okay? And you need to be able to understand and process how things are supposed to be organized, and effectively use language, okay? So that's kind of one of the main things that they're going to be testing you on in terms of kind of the overall structure of the writing and language test, is that they're going to be looking at your ability to be a reader, to read and analyze and interpret information, and assess it. And you're also going to be looking at your ability to, like, so your ability basically as an audience, as well as, so to receive the author's intended message. But they're also going to be looking at you as a, like, to understand things on a writing level, to understand what the author's choices are that they're making and why, because we never do anything, I mean, everything is deliberate, whether we're conscious of it or not when we're doing writing. We're making stylistic choices, we're making rhetorical choices all the time, to better convey our message, like more accurately convey and more efficiently convey our message, and purpose, and to achieve our purpose in writing, okay? Because we always have to have a purpose when we're writing. Whether it's to entertain or if it's to convey information or to persuade or argue a given topic. We are always trying to convey, we have some greater purpose that's binding our kind of writing together, okay? And then you're also going to be looking at, they're going to be asking you to look at things as an editor, like as to be able to critique other people's writing, to analyze other people's writing, to be able to identify when someone isn't using evidence appropriately or are misinterpreting evidence, or they are making poor choices in terms of effectively conveying their message because they're being imprecise in terms of their language, or they're making errors in grammar, or in kind of just language use overall, and in being able to convey your ideas and elaborate those ideas. Those are all kind of key skills that you've been all learning since you started learning language and learning to write, okay? So these are all kind of skills that you should all have or have been working on. So it's just more of a matter of familiarizing yourself um, with the kinds of terms that they use on this test, because most of the time you are going to see things, they might ask you a question that you haven't really thought about in years, or maybe you never formally learned the term when you were learning learning English. But there's still going to be skills and things that you can work on, even if you can't remember the specific term, okay? So part of what we're going to be doing in our grammar review, unless anyone else has any other specific questions you want to look at from practice test 6, is to refresh your memory on some of these kinds of terms, or to teach you the terms for the first time, okay? And all that does is help you answer the questions more efficiently. However, you as a native speaker, if you're a native speaker of English or whatever language is your native tongue, you've still had to learn English grammar rules, still had to learn how to write effectively and convey information effectively, to communicate effectively. So even if you technically don't know the technical term for something, you can figure it out given the context of what they're asking you to figure out, of looking in isolation at the grammatical construction that they're having you analyze, identifying whether you're dealing with ideas specifically, or if you are dealing with grammar, or if you're dealing with technique in terms of writing or editing, in interpreting and understanding information, okay? Those are the kinds of things that they're gonna ask you. So you don't necessarily have to know the specific terms, like what an appositive phrase is, for instance, but you should be able to figure out, based on the context, grammatically what they're asking you to do, or in writing, what they're asking you to do, or writing and editing, what they're asking you to do, or as a reader, what task they're asking you to focus on. You should be able to figure that out based on the context that are in the paragraphs and in the work as a whole. So it's just kind of, it's easier if you know the terms, which is kind of why we've been doing this grammar review too. Any other specific questions from practice test 6 before we go dive into grammar? Anyone? No? Okay. All right, awesome. All right, so why don't I'll change gears. Okay, so this is the handout that I shared with everyone last time. You should be able to see that on your screen. Does anyone not see kind of the handout from last week? No? Okay. All right, so basically, just a kind of quick review of what we started discussing last week. What you need to really know for the SAT regarding writing and language are word order and classification. So you definitely need to know what your 8 parts of speech are. So those are the categories or the method of classification for different types of words in a language, okay? And all of those words will perform different functions based on the category in their classification, okay? So they perform different functions in a sentence. And even within those categories, you're going to have variations. You're going to have slightly different purposes and functions, okay? And it's your responsibility to make sure that you're familiar with those, at least on a basic level, in terms of identifying and understanding what each of these are and why, like what their general purpose is, okay? Because the general purpose is going to help you identify question types, but also identify kind of what the function is of a particular grammatical construction in a given sentence or in a given work. Does that make sense? Okay. So you need to know things like nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, pronouns, conjunctions, prepositions, interjections, which we should have discussed last week, I believe. You also need to understand things like subject, verb, object, word order. Word order in English is critical to our understanding of meaning. So if you change the order of a word, like of words in a sentence, it's going to change the meaning. And to give you like a very quick example, which I think I discussed last week, but you have an example like the cat climbed the tree. Even if you change 2 nouns, cat and tree are both nouns, if you change the order and say the tree climbed the cat, unless we're dealing with some mythical universe that could happen in, that's not realistic. And it's not, it doesn't make sense to a native speaker. It's nonsense, basically. But technically, it technically kind of fits grammatically in terms of its structure. So you have a noun that's acting as the subject of the sentence, which could be cat or could be tree. And you have a noun that is acting as an object in the sentence. So in this case, the tree in this first sentence is what the cat climbed. So it's describing, it's providing additional information in the predicate of the sentence. So the essentially the what's happening section of like what's going on section of the that starts with your verb, okay? Because the predicate in its most simplest form is always going to be your verb. And the subject is always going to be a noun or a pronoun that's acting as the subject of the sentence, telling who or what the sentence is about, okay? So technically speaking, this could be like this is technically grammatical. It's just nonsense in terms of our understanding of what is occurring in the sentence, okay? Like the scenario that is painting is nonsense, okay? But it proves the point here that even by just changing one word, even though that's still technically correct, you're dealing with subject. You have the tree is your subject, climbed is your verb, cat is your object, or cat vice versa, okay? You're still dealing with subject, verb, object, word order. So technically it works in grammar, in English grammar. But it changes the meaning, okay? So the meaning will still change even if you just change two words that are the same type, okay? Anyway, the same thing is true if you or a similar situation is true if you change different parts of the sentence to different places. Like if you put your object first, like if we start at this as cat, the, climb, tree, the, that would not make any sense to us as native speakers of English because the word order is off. Okay, it's not, that would be object, verb, subject order, which in an abstract form. Anyway, other things that you need to know for the SAT writing and language section is that it's going to test your understanding of types of phrases, clauses, and sentences and the differences between them. It's also going to ask you to identify things like types of sentences used in paragraphs, just like we were talking about earlier today with topic sentences, etc., and transitional sentences. So types of sentences used in paragraphs and different genres of writing. You're also going to be asked, does everyone know what I mean by a genre of writing? Before I move on there. Yeah? Okay. So by genre of writing, specifically, I mean, are you, kind of ties into your purpose in writing on a broad level. You can have literary genres where you're dealing with things like a mystery or a work of fiction versus nonfiction, or if you're dealing with, which are very broad categories for fiction and nonfiction. Or you could be dealing with memoir, which would be a form of nonfiction writing. And it would be, you'd also be dealing with things like science fiction, kind of historical, science-based, like all these kind of broad subject categories that are dealing with the content of the literary genre that you're functioning in. Like if you're dealing with a narrative in terms of writing genre, that's more of a writing genre. You have a very broad category and different types of writing fall into that category. Like you can have a novel, you can do short stories, you could have a fable, but all of them have slightly different purposes and slightly different structures, okay? In terms of length, in terms of content, like a fable being something that is going to be a story, that typically a folk tale of some sort, that is going to teach a lesson, a moral by the end of the story. That's the object of a fable, is to teach a lesson about something. Whereas a novel could just be to entertain. I mean, you have all these different kinds of, and short stories are basically like shorter condensed stories. Like they're not as long as other things like a novelette or um, even like a personal narrative essay or anything like that. Like all of those still fall under the idea of a narrative, but they are different from each other in terms of their function, in terms of their structure, in terms of the stylistic requirements and writing requirements that kind of go with hand in hand with that particular genre, in terms of writing genre. And then or that kind of literary genre, in terms of subject matter that's kind of being encompassed by that particular type of writing. Does that make sense to everyone? So type of passage. So yeah. So I mean, you're kind of dealing with in the SAT, you're dealing with different types of passages, but those are dealing more with the subject matter that you are focused on. So the content, the kind of essence of the subject matter that you're dealing with. So whether or not that is a science passage, it's a history passage, it's a social science passage, or whatever, or literary, whatever. That's going to affect your, like whether it's a work of nonfiction. So you would expect any science passages to be nonfiction, right? Whereas a literary passage could be nonfiction. I mean, it could be like historical fiction. It could be, which is loosely based off of an actual historical event. Or it could be something that you're dealing with that is completely made up, that's fantasy fiction, that is, I mean, it could be a mystery, it could be anything. It could be an adventure novel, it could be anything. It could be poetry. I mean, not that you would really be seeing poetry on the SAT, you're not. But just as an example, you're going to, like, so you're kind of understanding the framework that you would be working in or be expected to understand in terms of the writing and language section by being able to identify what the subject matter is, what type of work it is, what type of genre, your writing genre it is, based on the author's purpose, like their purpose with writing and the message that they're trying to convey. So in like a novel, for instance, your kind of central concept isn't really a thesis. I mean, it's an equivalent of a thesis in a way, but it's more of a theme, like, or a central idea that the author is trying to convey on a broader scale within the text as a whole. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah? Okay. So types of sentences used in paragraphs and different genres of writing are things that you should be familiar with in terms of dealing with the writing and language test. It's also something you need to be familiar with when you're dealing with the writing or with the evidence-based reading, because you need to be able to identify that, oh, this is the science passage that I'm dealing with, or this is the literary passage. You need to be able to identify that so that you can approach it correctly in terms of understanding what the structure is to answer the questions that follow. Whereas with the writing and language test, you're dealing more with knowing what the conventions are or expectations are within a given writing genre, okay? Or within a particular type of work, in terms of the expected structure for like a short story or for a kind of excerpt from an article or something like that, like in terms of dealing with essay structure or dealing with like a narrative structure, something like that. It's kind of what you need to know so that you can understand the differences in terms of the types of sentences that you're going to see, whether you're dealing with really topic sentences or if you're dealing like with an essay, or if you're dealing with topic sentences but in a different way for introducing new ideas or new kind of scenes in a narrative. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah? Okay. You're also going to be dealing with things like, you need to know things like types of punctuation, like a semicolon, colon, em dash. So your dashes. So dealing with an em dash, which is the longer dash, that is like Yeah, it's your longer dash. So it looks like, I don't know if I actually have one in here. I'll show you another time. But basically, I mean, the difference between a hyphen, which is a very short dash, and an end dash, which is slightly longer. So it's like two hyphens together. And then an M dash, which is three hyphens basically in length, in terms of its width. So it's one of those long dashes that you see. So, and they're used differently. And knowing things like comma usage, when it's appropriate to use a comma and when it's not, when you're dealing with things like comma splices, commas in a series, all of that, okay? So you need to understand types of punctuation and their grammatical function in a sentence, clause, or phrase, okay? And you also need to understand how to organize and combine sentences and paragraphs and effectively convey ideas and transition between ideas in a sentence, just like we were talking about today with that transitional sentence, okay? Being able to understand that that particular sentence actually was a compound sentence because you were dealing with two independent clauses that were being combined using a semicolon because they're related ideas. Okay, so there was a deliberate connection by the author between those two different ideas. They could have easily just separated them using a period, but they wanted to draw attention to the fact that it was they were connected, and they wanted us to notice that, and to understand that. Okay, to achieve their particular purpose. Okay, so those types of things, as well as how to compose various written works to convey a particular message and achieve specific purposes, explain like specific purposes using effective writing techniques. So everything that you've been doing in a writing oriented class for years, basically is all the skills you need for the SAT writing and language test. Okay. How to develop, explain, elaborate, and support ideas in writing, how to provide concrete evidence and source material and research. So these are all kind of key skills and ideas that they're going to ask you about, and you've seen in the writing and language test. You're also dealing with analyzing, interpreting, applying, assessing, critiquing, and synthesizing data from sources and infographics. So being able to do all of those things in relationship to ideas that are used by an author in a text, okay? How to revise and edit writing and to improve communication and expression of ideas. How to use particular writing and editing techniques to achieve your purpose in writing, and how to convey your message to your audience, and knowing who the audience, the intended audience, and unintended audiences may be, okay? Identifying and using types of figurative language, rhetorical strategies and techniques, literary and subject or genre specific terms and techniques in writing and speech. Those are all things that you've been studying for years. So these are all things that you should be very familiar with. And they're not going to throw something at you that they don't think that you've seen before. Although they do like to trick students. So you're always learning terms is helpful. Okay, so just to kind of recap here, some things that we were talking about, we're dealing like it from last week and this week. Syntax, in essence, it's sentence structure. That's what everyone kind of learns it as, but syntax is kind of an area of linguistics, which is the study of language, that deals with the arrangement, grammatical structure, and organization of words and phrases to create well-formed sentences in a language. So it's much more complex than just simply your sentence structure. It has to do with different kind of levels of understanding in terms of subject, verb, object order, where we're dealing with relying on grammatical structure to dictate or convey meaning. And it's also kind of connected to things on a word level in terms of where certain words will appear based on what type of category they fit into, what classification in our 8 parts of speech they kind of fit into, as well as their function in a sentence or in a paragraph or in a larger work as a whole. So those types of things you need to be familiar with. So everyone too should remember that sentences are expressing complete thoughts or ideas. Okay. And when you basically, you need a subject and you need a predicate. And in essence, your simple subject is always going to be a noun or a pronoun. So telling who or what the sentence is about. Whereas the simple predicate is always going to be your verb, which is telling what's happening in this, explaining what's happening in the sentence. It's the action, whether it's a mental action, a physical action, or emotional action, or a state of being. Okay. So in essence, those are kind of some of the key things that you want to look for. There are also broader categories in terms of complete predicate, complete subject. So the complete subject here, in my example here, from this handout, you had the cat. That would technically be the complete subject in the sentence. So because it's containing the article the, as the definite article the, as well as the noun cat. Cat is the noun that is acting as the subject in the sentence. So the cat is asleep in the basket. Is asleep is the verb, because it is the acting verb. It's the action that's really happening. It's the active verb. But asleep is also part of the verb because it's a past participle. It's a form of a verb that is used to create a form of the past tense. So it can't really be separated from is in this context in order to convey the appropriate meaning. Okay, so that in essence would be your simple predicate. But in the basket is part of the complete predicate. Okay, even though it's a prepositional phrase. So it's a prepositional phrase that's providing additional information about where the cat is sleeping. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. I'm not going to belabor all of these different things. But if anyone has any questions from the handout from this handout from last week, or on any specific grammar terms, please let me know. And we can discuss them. Since no one's really kind of brought forward specific grammar questions for me in the last few lessons, I'm going to kind of assume that you understand these kinds of concepts, or that you've been using the resources that I've handed out or recommended. So unless there are specific concepts that you don't understand, or question types that you've found that you've struggled with, I'm not going to know unless you tell me. So I won't know to go over particular types like appositive phrases or dealing with parallelism or things like that unless you, or subject verb agreement, unless you tell me. Okay. So it's everyone's responsibility to email me, contact me if there are particular questions, or raise your hand or contact me in class and request for me to basically workshop specific types of grammar questions, because grammar is a huge topic. And they don't always ask the same types of questions. I've given you in previous classes a list of the main types of things that they ask, or things that are typically seen on the exam, but that isn't to say that they're not going to throw another grammar term at you and expect you to know it. So, or a figurative language term or something like that you should have learned in school, but maybe haven't, or haven't really formally dealt with it in a few years, or at least actively been interacting with it and engaging with it. So yeah, that's kind of where we're going to end for today. Any questions specifically? Awesome job, everyone. Good luck with math. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Okay, so thanks for watching, and please remember to contact us at info@embracetutoring.com to set up any personalized private tutoring sessions you would like. Stay tuned for future videos, and best of luck with your studies. We definitely encourage you to visit our Instagram as well as TikTok pages if you have any questions along the way. Take care, guys. Best of luck with your studies.